She arrived the week my wife forgot my name and never quite left, not from the house. Not from the rooms her hands learned before mine. Not from the places in me that had been going dark one bulb at a time. And if you think that makes me a villain, then you have the luxury of a simple story that I know. Longer own, we hired her as a stopgap, that's what the care coordinator called it. A bridge while we figured out long-term options after Alma's second fall. And the agency sent a woman named Saul with a paper badge that read, Domestic Support, Hill. Country Home Care, and a voice too calm for the way June heat in Blanco, Texas. Pressed its thumbprint on the town until the cypress along the river drooped. She stepped into our kitchen and took inventory in 10 breaths, the chipped kettle, the rattling AC, my wife's pill caddy with 2 pink squares missed, the threadbare rug that should have gone months ago because it curled like a tongue, and she looked at me long enough to make me see the house the way a stranger would. A place that had been loved and then maintained and then endured, and my name is Calder. I am 65, a retired water district man who used to walk creek lines and argue with limestone and barbed wire, a man who believed that routine was the same thing as devotion until routine failed to keep my wife's bones from thinning or her sentences from dissolving halfway to meaning. The first day Saul cleaned the stove without asking, humming a little tune from nowhere. And Alma sat at the table watching like a child watches rain, eyes bright but unfocused, fingers worrying the hem of her dress, and when Saul said, Senora, may I brush your hair? My wife laughed at the sound of may and shook her head and then nodded yes and then forgot she'd nodded at all, and somehow that laughter soldered something in the room that had been clicking loose for years. If you were me, would you have felt relief like a guilty pleasure when someone else knew exactly which motion soothed your wife's sundown panic, or how to slide a spoon between her lips when her jaw set like a gate latch? Would you have stood there pretending to reorganize bills while your house exhaled a breath you didn't know it had been holding? The agency's paperwork said 4 afternoons a week, 4 hours each. Light housekeeping and meal prep, personal care as needed. And Saul followed it like a recipe until the lines blurred because life blurs lines. Sometimes for survival, she baked pan de elote on Tuesdays because my wife liked the smell of sweet corn even if swallowing was a 2-man job. And she left a wedge of it for me wrapped in wax paper with my name scrawled in round letters. Not Mr. Calder, just Calder, and that shouldn't have mattered but it did. Because a name written by someone who sees you inside the mess is a small defiance against erasure. She wore a plain blue dress and sneakers with the treads gone thin and kept her hair in a twist that made a single loose strand fall along her jaw. And if you think I am romanticizing a caretaker, then remember that I stood night after night, holding a basin while my wife retched from a medication that promised more time and delivered only new kinds of tired, and that I learned to smile with one side of my face while the other side went numb. The first boundary went when the agency called to say the schedule had changed. They could only offer 2 afternoons now, demand was up, and I said, we can't manage. And the woman apologized and said she'd try, and Saul, who was washing the one mug Alma always reached for, said quietly, I can stay after hours for cash, only if you need. And I should have said no because rules exist to keep men like me from confusing gratitude for permission, but I said yes and told myself it was temporary, a stopgap to the stopgap. She stayed until the cicadas sounded like power lines and the sky went purple behind the water tower, and my wife's eyes finally unhooked from the TV that spoke words she couldn't catch. And when I walked Saul to the door, she looked at the front step and said, "Careful. Lip of the stone is loose," and I said, "Been meaning to fix that," and she said, "Most dangerous words in a house," and it felt like a joke until it didn't. Alma started calling her La Chica de la Casa, the house girl. Not with malice but with the mind's old labels. And sometimes she stroked Sol's forearm and said, "You remind me of my sister." And then looked at me for confirmation she didn't need. And one evening when thunder stacked over the ridges and the power popped off, Sol lit the candle I keep in the junk drawer for hurricane season and placed it in a jelly jar, and told a story in Spanish about her grandmother braiding palm fronds during blackouts near Matamoros, and even though my Spanish is rusted, I heard the shape of a life there, border heat, long shifts, a child learning to make order from darkness, and the part of me that used to walk creaks at dawn recognized something old and clean in her voice. The way people talk when they have worked without witnesses, boundaries blur in the dark. It's true, but not in the way you're thinking, not at first. It was a Wednesday when she stayed past 10 because Alma was restless and kept standing and forgetting where the floor began, and I brewed coffee and we took turns watching. And somewhere near midnight Alma slept, finally, mouth soft open. The kind of sleep that steals the guilt from you because it looks like peace. And I whispered thank you to the quiet, and Saul looked at my hands and said, "You need to stop clenching," and before I could make a joke she took one of my hands in both of hers, not a lover's hold, a mechanic's, a healer's, and pressed her thumbs into the tight webbing between thumb and forefinger until a heat flared and loosened, and I did a shameful thing. I closed my eyes and let a sound leave me that I hadn't made since I was a boy and my mother rubbed liniment into a sprained wrist after summer league. I opened them and pulled back and said, "We can't," which was late and also true. And she nodded and stepped away. And her face did something small and exact that I will never be able to forget. It steadied itself the way a person steadies a tray so nothing tips even while walking a moving floor. The next morning guilt arrived like a bill I'd known was coming. I paid it by cleaning the porch and fixing the loose stone, by calling the agency to ask for a different schedule that never materialized, by telling myself that what had happened was a kindness misread by a man who misses being needed in ways that are easy to define, and then the world conspired to keep her here. A boil water notice turned the taps suspect, and Saul knew where to get jugs before HEB ran out. Alma's swallow worsened and Saul taught me how to thicken liquids without making them cruel. The AC choked, and a cousin of Sol's, a quiet man with a halo of black curls, came after hours and made it hum again for $50 and a 6-pack of the beer I shouldn't drink but still do on the back steps, when my brother called from San Angelo and said, "You can't keep this up, Cal." I said, "I'm not," and realized I had managed to divide the load by 2 in my mind. There was the work of keeping Alma alive, and there was the work of not confessing that if Saul left, something in me would go with her. Then came the night of the storm, the real one, not the metaphor. A straight-line wind shoved the live oaks like cattle, and the siren by the volunteer fire station wailed, and a neighbor's metal roof peeled and traveled, and our back door rattled like dice, and Alma shook and keened and tried to stand and could not. And I called Saul because I didn't know who else to call. And she answered on the first ring and said, "I am coming." And 10 minutes later she appeared soaked and bright with rain, hair loosed, eyes wide but certain, and she moved through the house like a practiced prayer, towels down, flashlights ready, bathtub filled. My wife's breathing folded into the rhythm of a song Saul sang under the crash of wind. A song I learned later was a lullaby her grandmother used when cholera took babies and the women had to sing anyway, after. When the street was glittered with leaves and the thunder moved toward San Marcos. She made caldo out of a grocery drawer I would have sworn was empty and coaxed 3 spoonfuls into Alma and 1 into me, and I don't know if love is the word, but something like it, something that includes competence, rescue, timing, and the strange intimacy of the ordinary done well, moved through the room. And I felt it and pretended I didn't until pretending was a lie I could taste. You may be waiting for the part where I fail in the obvious way. But let me tell you a harder truth. I didn't kiss her, she didn't reach for me. We built no bridge you could photograph, and still I crossed. Because crossing can be as simple as letting your chest bloom warm at the sound of a person's shoes in your hallway and arranging your afternoons around that sound as if it were a clock. The agency found out about the extra hours because I was careless with a check. Or maybe because neighbors talk and they called to say it violated policy, liability, supervision, all the words that snap lines taught. And I said I understood and they moved Saul to another client in Wimberley effective. Immediately, I came home that day with a bag of oranges and found her folding Alma's last clean nightgown with that precise patience I'd come to mistake for love, and she said, "They changed me," and my wife clapped like a child because she liked clapping at words she recognized, and I walked to the sink and stared at the window screen and the square of sky and felt the house begin to lean. She wrote her number on the back of a recipe card and pushed it toward me with 2 fingers, and it would have been so easy to take it, to build a secret schedule out of cash and hope. But she withdrew the card before I touched it and said, "No, Calder. Not for that, only if Alma falls and you can't reach the agency, only for safety." And she slipped the card under the phone book like a blessing you're not supposed to spend. The day she left, Alma slept unusually long. The kind of sleep that scares you into checking the rise at the throat again and again. And when she woke she asked, "Where is the girl?" And I said, "Working," and she nodded and said, "Good worker." And I sat on the edge of the bed and agreed out loud so I wouldn't have to agree in my head about the other things. For a while I tried to prove to myself that she hadn't never left by preserving her in the house the way smell lingers, using her folding method on the towels, buying the same dish soap, playing the same radio station that made her hum, and sometimes, when the afternoon burned quiet, I'd hear a sneaker scuff on tile that wasn't there and I'd answer a room where no one stood. And because life regards our vows and our weaknesses with the same indifferent patience, there came a morning when Alma did not wake. The nurse said it was peaceful. The doctor said the heart is a long-distance runner that sometimes stops mid-stride without spectacle, and the priest said words I half heard through the fog of papers and casseroles. I chose a sky-colored dress for her and pressed the wrinkles out like I was ironing memory itself, and the funeral was small because our friends now have walkers or our names in the book at the back of church, and after the last dish was washed and the last hug collapsed, the house finally did what it had been threatening to do for months. It echoed. A week later I drove to the river at dawn and sat on the limestone ledge where the water eddies green, and it should have felt like freedom because the hard part of love had ended. But it felt like standing in a room after a concert, ears ringing, trash on the floor. That stubborn ache that says the music has gone where you can't follow. I pulled the recipe card from my wallet, not because I'd called, but because I'd carried it like a saint in a pocket, and I stared at the number until the digits blurred, and then I dialed, and when she answered she said my name the way a person answers a door in daylight, not startled, not thrilled, just ready, and I said, "There's leftover caldo in the freezer with your handwriting on it," and she said, "You need help eating it," and I said, "I need help knowing where to put my hands now." And we let the silence sit until it became a place we could both stand. She came that evening with store flowers she said were too bright, and a loaf of bread she said was too soft, and we ate at the little table Alma had once sanded smooth. And Saul told me about her new clients and the way a man in Wimberley insists on pretending he's fixing his fence when he's just leaning on it to talk. And I told her about the river at 5 a.m. and how the herons have a way of standing that makes patience look like an art. And when the candle burned low she stood and rinsed the plates and turned to me and said, "I can come by sometimes, for you, not paid, just company." And I shook my head no, because grief is a kind of honesty I didn't want to betray 2 weeks in. And she nodded yes, because she reads the part of people that isn't their mouth. She still didn't kiss me, I still didn't build a bridge you could point to. And yet she never quite left, not from the house where her folding remains in the towels. Not from the small habits that keep a man upright, not from the part of me that learned, late, what presents can do. Sometimes after supper we walk to the river and sit without touching, while bats skitter over the water like thrown pebbles. And she tells me a story about Matamoros or San Antonio, or the bus ride where a woman carried a rooster in a basket like a secret. And I tell her about aquifers and gauge stations and the simple arrogance of men who think water can be owned, and when we part at the gate she says, "Buenas noches, Calder," like a benediction, and I know that the easiest narrative would have me confess to a shiny terminal sin, but the truth is duller and more faithful. A woman came into my house to keep my wife safe, and in doing so she taught me a gentler way to hold the life that was left. And when the life changed, she didn't vanish the way help so often does. She thinned into the ordinary until the ordinary held. If you were me, would you be brave enough to call that love? Or would you call it gratitude with a longer shadow? I still talk to Alma in the mornings while I butter toast. I still fix the small things that can be fixed and let the others be. I still fold the towels her way, a third and another, smooth edges. No wasted motion. The house is quieter now, yes. But when I pass the phone book and see the edge of a recipe card tucking its corner like a shy bird, I know that "never left" isn't always a haunting. Sometimes it's a promise whispered to the bones, that what saved you will keep circling. Not to take, not to claim, but to make sure you remember the steps back into yourself.